I don't believe in the Beatles. There's no other way of saying it, is there? I don't believe in them. Whatever they were supposed to be, in everybody's head, and including our own for a period. It was a dream. I don't believe in the dream anymore. That's all.
Why did the Beatles break up? Well, that's easy, and it's been answered hundreds of times. It was a combination of factors: interpersonal, financial, situational, Brian Epstein's death, Paul's ego, John's relationship with Yoko, their wildly overambitious and failing business venture, Apple Corps, and their hiring of band manager, Alan Klein. Put simply, it was complicated, but we already know the answer. But what if I told you that this wasn't even the tip of the iceberg? Not even close. What if I told you that this was all set in motion before the Beatles even existed? This video isn't just the timeline of the Beatles' final days. It's not a point A to point B explanation. It is an exploration of the interpersonal relationships of a specific group of people in a specific period of time. Their traumas, their dreams, egos, greed, and of course, their music. From the outside looking in, the Beatles seem to have it all. Charisma, money, and more than anything, near limitless talent. It could be argued that no modern musical act has shaped our culture more than the Beatles, and they did this all in 7 years as a recording act. Then how? Why did it all fall apart so bitterly? These are 4 lads who had practically grown up together, experienced fame, loss and love together. What went wrong? On April 10th, 1970, the news would hit the Daily Mirror in huge, bold letters. Paul is quitting the Beatles. And following the release of this article, the 4 Beatles were never again in the same room. And if we want to begin to understand why, we have to start at the beginning. The very beginning. This is why the Beatles broke up.
People like me are aware of their genius, so-called, at 10, 8, 9. I always thought why has nobody discovered me? I used to say to my auntie, you've thrown my fucking poetry out, and you'll regret it when I'm famous. And she threw the bastard stuff out. I never forgave her. Why would they keep forcing me to be a fucking cowboy like the rest of them? I was different. I was always different. Why didn't anybody notice me?
Half of what I say is meaningless. Julia Stanley was a bright and talented woman. She came from a fairly prosperous, middle-class family and was considered the prettiest of all her sisters. So her parents were not at all happy when at the age of 14, she struck up a relationship with a poor, lower-class boy who was named Alf Lennon. Their disapproval mattered very little to her. Her and Alf were a match made in heaven, or more accurately, hell. They were both musical, witty, and incredibly headstrong. They would marry at a register office 10 years after their meeting. Then the very next day, Alf would sign up as a steward on board a luxury liner, which would take him away for 3 months. From this point on, the two saw each other very rarely. But in January of 1940, Julia became pregnant with a baby boy. On October 9th of the same year, with Alf Lennon away at sea, Julia would give birth to John Winston Lennon. This in no way changed Alf's lifestyle. He stayed away at sea, sending Julia a small sum of his wages every 2 weeks. But around the time John reached a year old, Alf vanished. He went AWOL, jumping ship in the United States. No more money came John and Julia's way. He would not return for 18 months. When he did, for a brief period, he would live, for the very first time, with Julia and John. It didn't last. He would leave again. They would see Alf for only a few weeks out of the year. 5 years later, Julia had an affair and became pregnant. Nowadays, no one would blame Julia, having been subjected to a life with an absentee husband for years and years. But for the period, This pregnancy was a disgrace and a catastrophe. She gave birth to a girl whom she named Victoria. After 6 weeks, she was given up for adoption. John would never meet his half-sister. It was during this period when John first began staying with his aunt Mimi, though only intermittently. Julia was not doing well. The pregnancy had been difficult, and she had been very depressed ever since. Mimi had very little sympathy for Julia, who in her eyes was a shame on their family. Her disdain only grew as Julia began publicly seeing a new man named John Roberts, but better known as Bobby. They would begin living together, and this was the final straw for Mimi. In early July 1946, she declared that she would not have her nephew living in sin. John would be taken from his mother. Just 2 weeks later, Alf would return to find his wife living with another man, and his son living at Mimi's. He hatched a plan. John Lennon could not be happier to see his father. He was promised a day out with Alf. Little did he or Mimi know that Alf planned to leave the country with John and immigrate to New Zealand. When they didn't turn up, both Mimi and Julia desperately searched for John. Julia knew some friends of Alf's, so she went to speak to them and was able to obtain an address for Alf's brother's house in Blackpool. She and her partner Bobby rushed down, where they found John and Alf. There exists a mythological telling of a dramatic scene where John was tearfully forced to choose between his father and his mother. This most likely isn't true, but the emotional impact was nonetheless the same. Julia and Alf talked and decided it was best for John to stay, but with Julia, not Mimi. Alf would leave once again. The next time John saw anything of his father was 20 years later, when he spotted a picture of him washing up in a hotel in the newspaper. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not going to sit here and try to diagnose John. I'll allow you to digest this on your own terms, and to try and understand the emotional impact that this had on John, on his relationships, on his worldview. This is a significant piece of the puzzle to understand the how and why of who John was and how he thought about the people around him, specifically those closest to him. John began living once more with Julia and Bobby. They had a flat of their own now, rather than living with Julia's father, and without his support, they were not at all well off. They all shared one small bedroom. Mimi was upset. She repeatedly contacted social services and pleaded her case to become John's guardian, and eventually, they agreed with her. John was taken from his mother once again. In the same summer, Julia became pregnant, though this time with a man who had remained reliable and loving throughout their time together. In March the next year, her second daughter, named Julia, after herself, was born. A little over 2 years later, she'd have another, Jackie. Young John Lennon did not really know or understand why he didn't live with his family. All he knew is that he wanted to be near them. Mimi did all she could to ensure that John saw as little of them as possible. But as he grew older, he grew more defiant, more capable, and would, on his own accord, sneak off to Julia's. His sisters have countless warm memories of playing with him. He was a fun, loving brother, and they, too, did not understand why he lived away from them. The following account was shared by his sister Julia. I remember wondering why John had to leave our house and our mummy and go somewhere else. I overheard John and Daddy talking in the kitchen one day. My father was telling John to stay if he wanted to. He was holding his shoulders, looking right into him. You don't have to go, John. He would go see Mimi himself right now. This can't go on. Let's sort it out once and for all. This was the summer term of 1955, when John was 14. Although he was visiting us openly, and more often than before, he still had to go back to Mimi's at the end of each visit, and he was becoming more distressed at leaving our mother, at leaving us. John was sobbing. I can't, John said. I'll be in so much trouble. I've got to go, but I'm going to stay all summer. But John didn't get to stay with us all summer. He was sent to Scotland with Nanny to keep him away from his mother and the house of sin. As a teenager, John grew more and more interested in music, a shared passion with his mother. The very first tune I ever learned to play was That'll Be the Day. My mother taught it to me on the banjo, sitting there with endless patience until I managed to work out all the chords. She was a perfectionist. She made me go through it over and over again until I had it right. First time hearing Buddy absolutely knocked me for a loop, and to think it was my own mother who was turning me on to it all.
It gets through. To me, it got through. It was the only thing to get through to me. Out of all the things that were happening when I was 15, rock and roll was real. Everything else was unreal.
A new kind of music began to seize Britain, skiffle. And in January of 1956, at the age of 15, John would form his own skiffle group, the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen slowly began to get bookings, and on July 6th, 1957, they would play the Woolton Fete. And it was on this day, after the performance, that John would meet a very important person in our story, Paul McCartney. They instantly connected and began playing music together. John was impressed with Paul's ability, and not long after, Paul officially joined the group. Paul, the younger of the two, looked up to John tremendously. In fact, he was all of the things that Paul wanted to be. But John was far more cautious than Paul. We'll again share a recollection from John's sister Julia, one which will prove very prophetic. John, initially, had different ideas about Paul. He could see that Paul was more outwardly sociable than he was, even though he was younger. Maybe he felt threatened by Paul's gregarious personality, worried that it might interfere with his unquestioned leadership of the Quarrymen.
I had a group. I was the singer and the leader. I met Paul, and I made a decision whether to, and he made a decision too, but I made a decision whether to have him in the group or not. Was it better to have a guy who was better than the people I had in, obviously, or not, to make the group stronger or to let me be stronger? And that decision was to let Paul in to make the group stronger.
Paul and John began to grow closer. John's mother, Julia, on learning that Paul's mother had recently passed from cancer, encouraged John to have him over for dinner, and the introduction of Paul did wonders for the Quarrymen. Initially, they were really just a bunch of musically enthusiastic teenagers. John was the most talented of the bunch by a significant margin. But with Paul joining, they now began to resemble a legitimate band. And that trend would only continue, as on one day, Paul would introduce John to a younger but very talented boy. His name was George Harrison.
Paul introduced me to George, and Paul and I had to make the decision, I had to make the decision whether to let George in. And I listened to him play, and said, play raunchy, or whatever the old story is, and I let him in. I said, okay, you come in, and that was the three of us then, and then the rest of the group was thrown out gradually.
Things were looking up for John. He was gaining independence and confidence. He was getting closer than ever to his mother, and even planned on finally leaving his home with Aunt Mimi to come and finally live with his family. Then, on July 15th, 1958, John's mother, Julia, was killed. It was a sudden, senseless death. She was run down by a vehicle driven by an off-duty police officer, one who was a learner driver with no license, no insurance. He would be charged with manslaughter and later acquitted. Her death was near instant and just down the street from her home, as well as Mimi's. Years later, John would recall, "It was awful, like some dreadful film where they ask if you're the victim's son. Well, I was, and I can tell you, it was absolutely the worst night of my entire life. I lost my mother twice, once as a child of 5, and then again at 17. It made me very, very bitter inside. I had just begun to establish a relationship with her when she was killed. We'd caught up on so much in just a few years."
It was the worst time of his life, and, his mother getting killed was just like the thing that topped it. And he started drinking a lot during that time. It was a very bad period for him. In fact, I remember finding him on a bus one night, and I was coming home late, and he was laying on the back seat of the bus upstairs, just like out of his head, unconscious. And he'd been on this bus for like 2 hours, and backwards and forwards to the terminal, and backwards and forwards, and I just kind of carried him off the bus and carried him up.
Let there be no doubt about it. Paul is a far more difficult nut to crack then John. Part of this is easy to explain. Paul is still alive, so unlike John, there have not been numerous, borderline exploitive novels written about him after his death by friends, family, or lovers. But the largest part is Paul himself. Despite John's tough exterior, he wore his heart and emotions on his sleeve. Throughout his life, he had no problems sharing the more difficult aspects of his life and of his personality. But Paul kept, and still keeps, his inner life far more closed off than John. It is only very rarely that we have seen through the cracks. While John was raised in a middle-class family, Paul's was firmly working class. Despite this, his parents made great effort to ensure that their children never felt less than. They raised them to be almost overly polite, and imbued in them an easy kindness and charisma. When the family moved to Forthland Road in 1955, it was a great financial stress for them. But they wanted their children to grow up somewhere safe. Though the death of Paul's mother Mary was not as instantaneous as the death of John's, it was still very sudden. Mary had been in pain for weeks, and despite working as a nurse in the constant company of doctors, she neglected to bring it up. She was a natural caretaker, and she did not prioritize herself. Mary had breast cancer. She was given a mastectomy, but it was too late. In just a few weeks' time, she became incredibly fragile. On October 31st, 1956, Mary McCartney passed away. Jim McCartney, her husband, and Paul's father, was obviously grief-stricken, but very quickly suppressed his grief, determined that it not weigh on his children. In 1997, the official Paul McCartney biography, many years from now, was released. It was written by his good friend Barry Miles, but is in large part autobiographical. Most of the book is made up of recollections from Paul himself, and in this book, Paul does not linger long at all on his mother's death, and talks very little to none about how it made him feel. Paul, as the eldest child, 2 years older than his brother Mike, may have felt similar to his father in that he needed to neatly tuck his grief away, to simply go on as though nothing happened, to keep things moving. A trend that would continue later into his life.
How did you find out about it?
I got a phone call this morning.
From whom?
From a friend of mine.
Are you planning to go before the funeral?
I don't know yet.
Have you discussed the death with any of the other Beatles?
No.
Do you plan to?
Probably, yeah.
What were you recording today?
I was just listening to some stuff, I just didn't want to sit at home.
Why?
Oh, I didn't feel like it.
What time did you hear the news?
This morning sometime.
Very early?
Yeah. Go now, yeah? Drag, isn't it? Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.
There is only one quote from Paul in this entire portion of the book that is revealing of any grief or of the pain that he felt and is harbored inside of him to this day. There's one moment I've regretted all my life, which is a strange little awkwardness for me. There was one time when she said ask, and she pronounced it posh, and I made fun of her, and it slightly embarrassed her. Years later, I've never forgiven myself. It's a terrible little thing. I wish I could go back and say, I was only kidding, Mum. I'm sure she knew. I'm sure she didn't take it too seriously. Following her death, Paul, more than ever, began pouring himself into music. It became his obsession, his unrelenting passion. The passion that, of course, led him to John. When George Harrison was first introduced to John by Paul, he was looked upon as a child. He was a little under 2.5 years younger than John, which, to be fair, seems a much larger gap when you're 17 and the other is 14. And John, at least, never really outgrew this perspective of George, a perspective he never really held for Paul, despite Paul only being around 9 months older than George himself. But while Paul was surprisingly self-assured for his age, looking up to John, but still maintaining a sort of mutual respect, it was clear from the jump that George idolized John, and frankly, for a long time, this got on John's nerves.
Paul introduced me to George, where I had to make the decision whether to let George in. But George was 10 years younger than me or some shit like that, and I couldn't be bothered with him when he first came around. He used to follow me around like a bloody kid, hanging around all the time. I couldn't be bothered, It took me years to to come round to him, you know, to start considering him as an equal or anything. I mean, he was a kid.
Unlike any of the other Beatles, George would have the privilege of growing to adulthood with a two-parent household. A two-parent household that, despite being fairly poor, was extremely supportive of George. They greatly admired his musical drive and continually spurred him on. Despite both his parents being raised Catholic, they never pushed a specific religion upon George or his siblings, with his sister Louise recalling, "As kids, we were always encouraged to find out for ourselves what we believed in. We were spiritual, not religious." There is no doubt about it. Ringo is different to any of the other Beatles. This is often framed as a negative thing, a lack of talent, of ambition. While the other three dove headfirst into arts, politics, spirituality, innovation, Ringo remained far more static. The traumas of John Lennon's childhood have been analyzed and pored over endlessly, exhibited here again by myself, but something that is often overlooked is just how difficult Ringo's was as well. Ringo grew up fatherless and the poorest of any of the Beatles. At the age of 6, he went into a coma for several days. Due to complications from an appendectomy, he would spend an entire year in the hospital recovering. Just a few years later, he would contract tuberculosis and spend 2 years in a sanatorium. By the time he recovered, despite being far from unintelligent, any hopes of educational pursuits were far behind Ringo. He seemed destined to follow the same career path of many others in the Dingle area of Liverpool. Hard, grueling labor. But by all accounts, Ringo was never down on himself or his circumstances. There seemed to be inside of him some innate appreciation for simply walking and breathing. He worked briefly at the railway, but was laid off. Eventually, his stepfather was able to get him a job at a factory where Ringo met a man named Roy Trafford, who was a huge fan of skiffle music. The two bonded and began playing music together. On Christmas Day of 1957, Ringo's stepfather Graves bought him an incredibly crude second-hand drum set. The rest is history. What I hope to impart on you all here are the seeds of these lads, the effect that their childhood, just as it does for us all, had on their personalities, their dreams, and their shortcomings. Childhood is the most impressionable period of our lives, and the aftershocks of our experience during this time continue far into adulthood. This is the first step in understanding who the Beatles were.
Hello, little girl. Hello, little girl.
Sex. Yes, sex. Oh no, you say. Are we about to be subjected to some amateurish Freudian psychobabble? Mostly no, I promise. But sex is sex, and is a large piece in anyone's development. And funnily, is a large piece of the Beatles' musical development too. Being in a band is cool. Being cool gets you girls. If we play in a band, we will get girls. This is something that all of the Beatles have expressed to some degree. And this is not to undermine the insatiable passion they all held for music, but this was undoubtedly a little extra incentive. Like most boys, for the Beatles, things began with a little self-exploration. Eventually, this evolved into the occasional bit of group masturbation between John, his close friend Pete Shotton, Paul, and some other mates. They'd sneak off into the bushes or stay over at a friend's house and begin calling out the names of whatever starlet popped into their head, John's favorite being Bridget Bardot. There is the famous story of one particular session when John, just as things were heating up, impassionately called out the name Winston Churchill, sending the rest of the boys into hysterics. The next step, of course, were girls and girlfriends. And from the go, John specifically would demonstrate a behavior that would haunt him throughout his life. A severe jealousy, a need to lock up his partner in a little box to control her. This was exacerbated by John's anger and drunkenness following the death of his mother. This isn't some secret or huge gotcha. This is something that John himself has admitted to extensively, as well as expressed in his songwriting. In October of 1957, John would enroll at the Liverpool College of Art, and it was here, in a lettering class, that he would meet his future wife, Cynthia Powell. He was very different from the clean-cut boys I was used to. His outspoken comments and caustic wit were alarming. I was terrified he might turn on me, and he soon did, calling me Miss Prim or Miss Powell, and taking the mickey out of my smart clothes and posh accent. The first time he did it, I rushed out of the room, red-faced, wishing he'd disappear. But as the weeks went by, I began to look forward to seeing him. He made me laugh, and his manner fascinated me. I had always been in awe of authority, anxious to please and do well, but John was the opposite. He was aggressive, sarcastic, and rebellious. They continued their somewhat cruel flirtation, and as the term's end drew near, John would ask Cynthia out, but Cynthia already had a boyfriend, and on telling John so, he immediately responded, "I didn't ask you to fucking marry me, did I?" Cynthia felt immediate regret, but just hours later, John asked if she would like to join him and some friends at the pub. This time, she said yes, but John's pattern of behavior would not end with Cynthia. John's temper could be frightening, and at times I felt torn to pieces by him. All sense of reason disappeared, and his tantrums were awesome. He would batter away at me verbally until I gave in, overwhelmed by the force of his determination. Then he was back to his usual self, apologetic and loving. He was full of contradictions and confusion. He wanted proof, daily, that he mattered most to me. Cynthia would become very familiar with John's bandmates, two of those, of course, being Paul and George. In regards to John and Paul, she would say they complemented each other. John needed Paul's attention to detail. Paul needed John's anarchic, lateral thinking. In those days, Paul tried hard to impress John, posing and strutting with his hair slicked back to prove that he was cool, because John was very much the leader. It was his band. He had final say about who got in and who didn't. George was the kid who tagged along. He was always serious, and his shy, toothy grin only ever flickered for a moment before it disappeared. They tolerated him because he was good, but they patronized and often ignored him when they were absorbed in something together. Cynthia was not the only pivotal figure John would meet in art college. It was also there that he would meet a certain Stuart Sutcliffe. Stuart was a slight but good-looking man and an incredibly talented artist. John immediately respected him as a peer, and the two became close friends. Stuart was without a doubt John's closest confidant, far more so than Paul, who, despite growing ever closer to John, was not someone John looked up to, like he did with Stuart. And when John grew close to someone, he grew intensely close, as he later would with Paul, and then Yoko. Yoko herself would later say, "John once said, I looked up to Stu. I depended on him to tell me the truth. Stu would tell me if something was good, and I'd believe him." It would be hard to overstate just how significant Stuart's impact on John was. Stuart's sister, Pauline, would recall, John had a desperate quest for a certain kind of nurturing. Stuart's nurturing was unconditional. He loved him, and John recognized that Stuart believed in him, that he believed he wasn't just a mad, destructive anarchist, but was somebody of worth. Stuart freed John's own creative spirit.
I went down with Yoko and we tripped out again, and she filled me completely to realise that I was me and it's all right, you know. And that was it.
How?
And I started fighting again and being a loudmouth again and saying, well, I can do this and fuck you know, and this is what I want.
John was not content just to have Stuart as a best mate. As for John, so much of his identity, his passion, was tied up in music. So it was only right that he joined the band. And Stuart, for his part, cooperated, despite having little to no musical experience at that point. He saw Stuart as a creative partner, just as he later would with Yoko. One night, those two closest people to John, Cynthia and Stuart, would intersect. At a party, the two began casually dancing together. Cynthia recalls, as soon as I saw the look on John's face, we stopped, and as so often before, I reassured him that it was him I loved. He seemed to accept it, but the next day at college, he followed me to the girls' loo in the basement. When I came out, he was waiting with a dark look on his face. Before I could speak, he raised his arm and hit me across the face, knocking my head into the pipes that ran down the wall behind me. Without a word, he walked away, leaving me dazed, shaky, and with a very sore head. I was shocked, really shocked, that John had been physically violent. I could put up with his outburst, the jealousy and possessiveness, but violence was a step too far. They would briefly separate before getting back together. Over the course of the next year, the band would slowly become more legitimate. For a brief moment, when the band was composed only of John, Paul, and George, they called themselves Johnny and the Moondogs. After that, the Silver Beatles, before finally settling on the Beatles. They would roll around Liverpool, practically begging for gigs, and were eventually introduced to a man named Alan Williams, a manager of sorts, who would set them up with a gig that would change the Beatles forever. A multi-month appearance in Hamburg. The Beatles, without a drummer, hastily recruited Pete Best, who had recently been gifted a drum set, and with that, off they went. Hamburg did a lot for the boys. It forced them to become performers. They were not some blow-your-shoes-off act at this point, and honestly, according to those who had seen them before in Liverpool, they weren't very good at all. So to satisfy the Hamburg crowds, they went fucking crazy, aided by their use of amphetamines, which would continue throughout their career. They would play every night for hours on end, a feat which did, over the course of those months, significantly tightened their musical abilities as a band. It was also in Hamburg that they were given a small piece of the debauchery that would consume their touring days, circling back, of course, to sex. Hamburg was a prostitution hotbed, and there were quite a few prostitutes or strippers who had no problem doing the boys a favor. The boys, sharing a room, all cheered when George Harrison lost his virginity. This hedonistic behavior would become a near nightly habit. By the time the Beatles returned to Liverpool, or rather, were kicked out of Hamburg, they little resembled the ragtag band they had been when they first left.
Because we didn't sound like everybody else, that's all. Please Please Me and From Me to You and all those were our version of the chair. You know, we were building our own chairs, that's all, you know.
It's time to speed up a little bit here. I'm not going to spend some significant chunk of time boring you with the stories you have all heard endlessly about the Beatles' inception, the trials and tribulations, and eventually the meteoric rise. I have several videos covering this already in great detail. What we'll cover instead are the interpersonal moments packed in between, those that continue to help us understand this group of boys. The next couple of years really were a whirlwind of activity, though much of that activity could be defined as treading water. The Beatles were undoubtedly a talented act. They quickly built up a fervent but very local fan base, which contrary to popular belief, was in large part due to Pete Best, who was about the most sought-after boy in Liverpool. They played music constantly, every single day, usually twice a day, at lunch and at night. They eventually got the gig that would become emblematic of their early days, in the sweaty dungeon of the Cavern Club. They made multiple trips to Hamburg. They were close friends with a couple of locals, Klaus Vormann, a very talented individual who would later illustrate the cover of Revolver, and Astrid Kircher, who had a wonderful eye for photography, and whose photos of the boys in Hamburg became a piece of their mythology. It was Astrid who would fall in love with Stuart Sutcliffe, and it was Astrid who, an artist herself, would encourage Stuart to pursue his creative ambitions, rather than being the worst bass player of any act in town. So eventually, this is what happened. Stuart would stay behind in Hamburg and enrolled in art college. Paul would take over the bass. The Beatles continued their everyday grind, but John never stopped writing to Stuart. At the end of 1961, the Beatles were introduced to a man who would change their entire trajectory, Brian Epstein. Brian Epstein was the owner of the Nims Music Shop, just down the street from the Cavern Club. His family owned a whole chain of retailers. When he finally decided to visit the Cavern for the first time, and see the band that was generating all this talk, he was instantly enraptured.
I hadn't had anything to do with pop management of pop artists before that day that I went down to the Cavern Club and heard the Beatles playing. And this was quite a new world, really, for me. I was amazed by this sort of dark, smoky dank atmosphere, this beat music playing away. And the Beatles were then just four lads on that rather dimly lit stage, somewhat ill-clad, and the presentation was, well, left a little to be desired as far as I was concerned, because I've been interested in the theatre and acting for a long time. But amongst all that, something tremendous came over, and I was immediately struck by their music, their beat, and their sense of humour actually on stage. And even afterwards, when I met them, I was struck again by their personal charm. And it was there that really it all started.
He offered to become their band manager. Brian had no experience as a manager. This was brand new for him. But as the owner of a music shop, he did have some connections, or at the very least, the ability to reach out to people who could become connections. But more so, Brian had the eye, the vision. The Beatles were talented, but also incredibly unprofessional. They ate and drank on stage, frequently arrived late to gigs, and as a whole, were a pain in the ass to deal with. All of this amounted to a simple truth. Despite their ability, without a change, the Beatles would not make it out of Liverpool. And what a change it was. As band manager, Brian procured the boys their signature suits, and really, just classed them up, told them to be professional. As the Beatles entered 1962, they had a brand new momentum. On January 1st, they traveled down to London to audition for Decca Records. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, in retrospect, they were firmly denied. But they never would have had this opportunity if not for Brian. This momentum continued, slow at first, with a couple of radio appearances, and then, in April of 1962, the Beatles would once more travel to Hamburg, excited to get into a bit more trouble, and also to see their friends, Klaus, Astrid, and obviously, Stuart, who John missed dearly. And it was on their arrival that they heard the news. Stuart Sutcliffe, John's closest friend, had died of a brain hemorrhage. Stuart had been suffering from severe migraines for some time now, and recently had collapsed in class. Astrid was terribly worried about him, and thought that he may have had a brain tumor, but no one expected for him to go as suddenly as he had. For John, it was the same old story. The following is recounted by Klaus Vormann. The others reacted completely grief-stricken, whereas John refused to accept the news. He looked us in the eye, and then one could see how it suddenly clicked, and John began to laugh, and didn't stop. We were aghast. Everyone deals with tragedies differently, and this was John's way. He was of the opinion that his friend's sudden death was deeply unfair, which was why he was not prepared to accept it. John and Stuart were enmeshed. Despite being very different, they both saw parts of themselves in the other, and more so, had a deep understanding of their mutual weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. I want to take a brief moment to address a rumor, one which I'm not going to sit here and regard as absolute fact, but one that is still nonetheless pertinent, that John and Stuart, maybe just briefly, had a sexual component to their relationship. Stuart's sister Pauline would recall, I have known in my heart for many years that Stuart and John had a sexual relationship. Everything I knew, personally and professionally, pointed towards it. If this rumor is false, it nonetheless rose out of a simple truth. When John found a true connection with someone, that connection became incredibly intense. Both Paul and George had found themselves jealous of John's relationship to Stuart and of his inclusion in the band, despite being a poor musician. The resulting tension from this culminated in a fist fight between Paul and Stuart on stage one night in Hamburg. With Stuart's death, a void had opened up in John's life once more, one which would need filling. It was not long after this tremendous loss that the Beatles received their first major break. Brian Epstein, with a little bit of luck, had managed to connect with a music producer at EMI, a man named George Martin. While Martin was not head over heels impressed, he did indeed see immense potential in the boys. Worth a shot anyway, but not in drummer Pete Best, who Martin did not consider up to par. It is now here where Ringo will join our story. Ringo was very well known to the boys, and the band he drummed for, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, had played alongside the Beatles 100 times, both in Hamburg and in Liverpool. Ringo was close to his bandmates, but on being offered a position with Liverpool's most popular band, a band that was about to travel to London to record their first single, the decision was clear. In June of 1962, the Beatles would receive their first ever recording contract, signing with Parlophone, and then they would record their first single, Love Me Do. The single did well, but was by no means a smash hit. And as far as Brian, the Beatles, and George Martin were concerned, this was partially because of the song's publisher, Ardmore and Beechwood. But wait, wasn't the song released by EMI, and more specifically, Parlophone? Yes, it was. And really, they were the ones responsible for promoting it. But let's just very briefly discuss the difference between a publisher and a label, because this will become very important later on. I'll try to put it as simply as I can. A publisher represents the songwriters, the compositions, and the copyright and licensing of those works. The label represents the actual recordings the artist or band produces, referred to as the master. So basically, EMI owns the recording of Love Me Do, but Ardmore and Beechwood own the composition. And the Beatles team did not feel that Ardmore and Beechwood did enough to help the song succeed. So when it came time to release their next single, Please Please Me, they decided to find a new publisher and eventually landed on a man named Dick James. Dick suggested that he, the Beatles, and Brian Epstein form their own company. This would become Northern Songs. The shares were divided as follows: 20% each for John and Paul, 10% for Brian, and then Dick and his business partner Charles Silver would own the other 50%. George and Ringo did receive small amounts as well, but basically, in the early days, Paul and John would earn more from a song George wrote than George himself would. George and Ringo would eventually establish their own independent publishing companies because of this. The Beatles would release Please Please Me under Northern Songs, and the song would eventually reach, depending on who you ask, number 1 on the charts. From there, things ballooned to a massive, unprecedented scale. And once they did, Brian's weaknesses finally came to the forefront. He was brilliant in so many regards, but as a businessman, he was very, very green.
But Brian was no good businessman. You know, he was he had a flair for presenting things. He was more theatrical than actual substance of business. And he was hyped a lot, you know. He was advised by the gang of crooks, really.
And the business decisions he made would pave the path to the Beatles' dissolution.
How ruthless do you think you've got to be? Not very. It may even be a fault of mine in the business that I'm not ruthless enough.
Initially, like so many in the same position, Brian Epstein had no desire to continue in the family business. They owned a number of successful furniture retailers, and the business expanded into music shops as well. But Brian was in love with the arts, the theater, and wanted to become a dress designer. But his father opposed this notion, and at his demand, Brian would join the family business. Brian was gay, an experience that can be incredibly isolating. He struggled with his mental health from an early age, and would see psychiatrists throughout his life. At the age of just 21, he drafted a handwritten will, which ended by wishing that his family know his eternal love for them. There's no way to assign intent to this document, but it is well within reason to believe that Brian contemplated suicide during this time. While he was still very much roped into the family business, they did allow him to attend Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts and to pursue his dreams of becoming an actor. And it was while a student that he was arrested for soliciting sex from an undercover police officer. Not only was prostitution illegal in Britain, but homosexuality itself. He would appear in court and plead not guilty, and was given a deal of 2 years probation, along with psychiatric treatment. His trouble would not end there. The next year, driving along the Strand, he went to go pick up a man who had previously been a sexual partner, and when he did, the man demanded Brian give him £20. Brian told the man he did not have the money on him, and so the man assaulted Brian, breaking a milk bottle over his head, and demanding that should Brian not return to him the next day with £20, he would tell everyone he was queer. Brian drove himself to the hospital where he received stitches in his ear that had been lacerated by the bottle. That night, he told his parents the truth of what happened. Whether they knew for sure he was gay before that point was unclear, but they insisted that the only correct action was to immediately report the incident to the police. The police took the report and then set up a sting, directing Brian to meet the man who had assaulted him, just as the man had demanded. When the assaulter arrived, the police moved in, chasing him through the streets before detaining him. Eventually, he would be sentenced to 2 years in prison. While Brian's name wasn't publicized in the papers, the whisperings were enough. To be outed as gay in this manner was devastating. Brian dropped out of acting school and poured himself into the family business, as he now ran their newly opened musical store on Whitechapel, and he was rewarded handsomely for his efforts, as his store became one of the most successful in all of North England. It was also at this time that he hired Peter Brown to manage a separate location. We will talk more about him later on. After what had been a tremendously difficult past few years for Brian and his family, things now seemed settled, and his family was very proud of what their son had accomplished. But they became worried once more when Brian impulsively began managing a local Liverpool band named the Beatles, and were afraid that it would take away from his ability to run the store. Suffice to say, they grew less worried as time went on. The Beatles brought a swath of attention toward the Merseyside in general, and Brian took full advantage, scooping up a number of local acts. And in fact, Brian's first #1 wasn't even courtesy of the Beatles, but Jerry and the Pacemakers, with How Do You Do It, the song that George Martin originally wanted the Beatles to record for their first single, before they insisted it be an original with Love Me Do. 1963 marked the beginning of true Beatlemania. The Beatles' entourage began to come into focus. These are all names to remember, as they will play roles in our story. There was of course Brian himself, and then his assistants and associates, Alistair Taylor and Peter Brown. Then we have the Beatles' 2 signature roadies, Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans. Their roles went far beyond those typically outlined. As they toured through the UK, the Beatles required frequent, quote-unquote, fixing and scrubbing. They maintained their surprisingly clean reputation for a reason, and it was in large part due to these men.
Yes, all those. We hired Neil in Liverpool and Mal in Liverpool. Those are the only people we ever hired. You know, I mean, the Beatles tours were like satirical. You know, I mean, we had that image, but man, our tours were like something else. If you could get on our tours, you were in, you know. Like anybody. They're all into now, but they didn't call them groupies then. They called it something else. But if you couldn't get groupies, we'd have whores and everything. Whatever was going, you know. Derek and Neil, that was their job. And Mal, but I'm not going into all that.
On April 8th, 1963, Cynthia Lennon gave birth to a son, Julian Lennon. It was a difficult pregnancy, one she mostly endured on her own as John toured with the band. John was not there when his son was born. By all accounts, when he did see his son for the first time, several days after his birth, he was jubilant and proud. But this did not change his behavior in any way. The Beatles' first vacation all year was coming up in just a couple of weeks. While the other 3 Beatles would be vacationing together, John chose to vacation alone with their manager, Brian. And John told Cynthia that he fully intended on doing so. Wife and child, be damned. He was going to leave them behind, just as his father had done to him.
Sim was having a baby, and the holiday was planned, but I wasn't going to break the holiday for a baby, you know, that's how, what a bastard I was, and I just went on holiday, you know.
It was abundantly clear that Brian had a crush on John. It was an open secret. He invited John alone on the trip to Barcelona, and John said yes. This immediately became the talk of the Beatles circle. There were numerous rumors of John and Brian having a love affair or sexual encounter while in Spain. This eventually resulted in John nearly beating to death his friend and Liverpool promoter, Bob Wooler, at Paul's 21st birthday party, after he insinuated something happened between John and Brian. John's longtime friend, Pete Shotton, claims that John told him he let Brian, quote, toss him off. And Peter Brown has said that Brian insinuated, but without saying so, that something happened. Regardless of if anything happened, the circumstances of this trip and the interpersonal implications were blurry, something that John himself, while denying that anything sexual occurred, acknowledged.
I was on holiday with Brian Epstein in Spain, where the rumours went round that he and I were having a love affair. Well, it was almost a love affair, but not quite. It was never consummated, but it was pretty intense relationship we had, and it was my first experience with a homosexual that I was conscious was homosexual, and that he'd admitted it to me. We used to sit in Torremolinos looking at all the boys, and I said, "You like that one? You like this one?" I was sort of enjoying the experience, thinking like a writer all the time, and I'm experiencing this, you know.
I like playing a bit, and all that, but it's enjoyable.
These are the facts. John was much closer to Brian than any of the other Beatles. Whether he enjoyed the power he held over his manager or saw a part of himself in Brian is unknown. But to leave your bandmates, and much more so, your wife and child, to vacation with your manager is incredibly bizarre and indicative of what John wanted or needed. So far, Brian had done his job with the Beatles brilliantly. He had promoted them about as perfectly as he could have, and leapt at almost every single opportunity presented to them. But Brian's inexperience began to show. When the Beatles traveled to Paris to perform at the Olympia Theatre, the venue's promoter, Bruno, offered very little for the appearances, and Brian did not even attempt to fire back. He also chose to lodge the Beatles and their entourage at Paris's most prestigious hotel, the Georges V. All in all, the Beatles made almost no money from the affair. But in December of 1963, Brian would commit his first significant gaffe, one which cost the band an unbelievable amount of money. Band merchandising was still in its infancy at the time, and was a developing industry. Beyond Elvis Presley, no musical act had produced much of a demand. But the demand for Beatle-themed products was like something never seen before. Initially, Brian permitted a small company, run by his cousins, to produce Beatles sweaters and badges. But as their popularity swelled, the company grew overwhelmed. Brian was hounded constantly by novelty goods companies, wanting to use the Beatles' image on a number of cheap products. But as Brian's demands grew, he asked his lawyer, David Jacobs, to find someone to take on the responsibility. Now, Jacobs was a reputable lawyer and represented some of the biggest stars in the world. He seemed as qualified to find the appropriate person as anyone could be. It wasn't his expertise, but surely, with his connections, he could find the correct candidate. Well, he could not have chosen much worse. Nick Byrne was a 37-year-old socialite with only the barest amount of experience in the music industry, and he had absolutely no experience in merchandising. Byrne was offered the job and agreed. He drafted a boilerplate merchandising contract and left blank the percentages in which Brian's company, Nims Enterprises, would receive from licensing the Beatles' image. He brought the contract to Jacobs, who asked what he should put down for the percentages. Byrne, wholly ignorant to the industry standard, basically said, let's just put down 10%. The typical going rate was 75 to 80%. Not only that, Byrne would receive 10% commission from the merchandisers for a license. So if the merchandiser earned $100, Byrne would receive 10, and then Nims Enterprises would receive 10% of that, so $1. Jacobs brought the contract to Brian, and Brian, not knowing any better, signed it.
To give him his due, though, Brian and us would not know about those kind of things. British people at that time didn't know about that stuff. I'm not so sure how much they know about it now, but I think the problems arose in as much as he was from Liverpool. He hadn't done this before. He had the great theatricality, but he hadn't done this kind of business before.
It could not have been any worse. Byrne partnered with several associates and formed the licensing company Celtabe. And as Beatlemania spread to the States, the company began raking in obscene amounts of money. Byrne would present Brian with his first check, coming out to $9,700, or $101,000 today. Brian was initially very impressed, but after innocently asking how much Byrne was owed, was told, "Nothing, Brian, that's your 10%. Byrne, boldly, then described just how much money he had brought in for himself. Brian was shell-shocked. He realized right away that he could not tell the Beatles. He had to keep them in the dark. He immediately returned to his lawyer, Jacobs, to renegotiate the contract, which after 7 months was raised to 49%, still well below the industry standard. But the damage had already been done, and more. Brian was in over his head, and the Beatles were completely blind to it. And with that, we must end Part 1. This is but only the slightest precursor for what is to come. Awaiting us are innumerable personal disputes, grudges, financial catastrophes, sycophantic enablers, and some of the greatest albums of all time. We have many more years to cover before we even come close to the Beatles' final days. And if you would like to continue the story, please consider subscribing so you don't miss out. These videos will release every 2 weeks. I also have a large number of videos recounting the Beatles' history and the making of their albums if you want to see more. If you want to watch part 2 of the series right now, you can do so by joining my Patreon for only $1 a month. It's a wonderful way to support the channel, and I would like to take a moment to personally thank all of my Patreon supporters. With that, thank you so much for watching. Until next time.